Hello and welcome back to Three Go Searching by Patricia St. John. Chapter 8, Safely Led. David woke with a start and not the slightest idea where he was. He was cold and stiff and lying on bare, wet boards. A large hand was shaking him urgently, but not unkindly. All around him were strange, unfamiliar sounds. The grating of the keel on a pebbly shore, the slapping of waves against the side of the boat, the sighing of wind on black water, and the whispering of men's voices. David began to cry with cold and bewilderment and the shadow of some half-remembered terror. But a hand was clasped firmly over his mouth till he stopped, and then he was lifted in strong arms that smelled of gasoline and tobacco, and set down on his feet on a pebbly beach. So dizzy was he with sleep and bewilderment that he fell over sideways. But the man picked him up again and propped him against a rock. A moment later, Waffy was dumped beside him, and they huddled gratefully together. "I must leave you," whispered the man. "The path up the cliff is just behind you, but you must wait till it gets light. It is not an hour now till dawn. Follow that path across the hills till you come to a village. It's a long way, but you can't miss it. Tell them who you are, and they will take you home. Your father is loved by the hill people. Go in peace, and may God help you. Don't forget my message." He was gone, and they heard the prow grate on the pebbles as the little boat moved away from the shore, and then the noise of the engine, which died away in the darkness. It was very dark indeed now. The moon had set, but the inky sky was crowded with fierce, bright stars, blazing their last before their light faded. The cliff loomed behind them, black and threatening, and just to their right a little stream splashed down a gully into the sea. It was no good looking for the path just yet. There was nothing to do but sit and wait, and while they waited, David watched the stars. His father had taught him about them, and he tried to find the constellations: Orion's belt, the Pleiades, the Milky Way, and sometimes, behind the mountains, the Southern Cross. Waffy whimpered and sniffed beside him, but David had stopped crying. There was no longer a silver pathway on the water, but surely the one who had walked on the sea and had drawn so near to them would guide them home. "Aye," moaned Waffy, "we shall die of cold on this beach before morning comes. Aren't you afraid?" David was silent. He was terribly afraid of the darkness and the tide and the mountains behind them, but his fear was like the little stream beside them, ever tumbling toward that great ocean depth of strength and love and being lost forever. He could not explain, but he wished Waffy knew. "I think we shall get home," he answered comfortingly, "and anyhow, they did not throw us into the sea." "Ah, David, you are so brave," sobbed Waffy. "Is it your Jesus who makes you brave?" "He's looking after us," answered David simply. "Shall I tell you how he walked on the waves, Waffy? It is no good trying to go yet." "Yes," said Waffy with a tired sigh, and the two little boys snuggled close as they could to each other in the shelter of the rock, while David told his story. "And when Jesus came into the boat, everything was quiet and calm, and no one was afraid any more," finished David. "Look, Waffy, the light's beginning to come." They turned and sat with their faces turned east, where the darkness had begun to pale. Already there was no more blackness. The sky was a deep blue, and the starlight was fading. The cliff rose ghostly gray behind them, and they could see the white foam breaking on the gray beach. "I think we could see the path now," said David. "Let's go and look." They stretched themselves, trying to get rid of the cold and stiffness, and limped painfully to the foot of the cliff. They soon found what they wanted, the bottom of a stony little track that wound its way up the face of the cliff. They started scrambling, clinging to the tufts of coarse grass and to the tamarisk bushes. The higher they climbed, the lighter it grew. By the time they had reached the top, the sea at their feet stretched away, a sheet of silver blue flecked with crimson, and the island rose from the mist like a fortress against a rosy sky. They sank down on the grass for a moment to rest and watch, but it was cold with dew. They got up and, turning their backs to the brightening east, took stock of the road ahead. In front of them stretched the hilly uplands, seamed with rock, rising higher into the hills and falling into valleys until it met the clear sky. The path seemed to run straight and true, although as yet there was no village in sight. They set off, trudging along in silence, for they were very weary. But there were many things along the way to cheer them. The sun rose and was warm on their backs, and they came to a spring where they could drink. Narcissus grew in scented clumps in the marsh where the water flowed, and once they came to a starry field of blue iris, wide open and dew-spangled. But each time they came to the brow of a hill and hoped to see a village, they were disappointed. The barren, uninhabited uplands seemed to go on forever. At last, they stumbled to the top of a hill higher than the others, and straight in front of them, across the next valley, like a sheer, impassable wall, rose the mountains, their rocks red in the early light. "We can't climb those," cried Waffy in a panicky voice. "There are monkeys and wild boars up there. I think we have lost our way." "No, we haven't," said David. "He told us to follow the path. Look, Waffy, there, down in the valley. There's a flock of goats. And over there, I can see some smoke. I think we have nearly reached the village." "Oh, praise be to God!" exclaimed Waffy fervently. "Let's go on. Do you think they will give us food, David? I am so hungry and empty. I could eat the grass." "I think they will," said David, who had never experienced anything but kindness from the people of the land. They trudged on, their feet blistered from the wetness of their sandals and the roughness of the road. Very soon the stony grassland and the low shrubs gave place to cultivated fields and terraced vineyards and old gnarled olive trees. The village was built on the slopes of the river basin at the bottom of the valley, and red rocks rose sheer on the other side. They approached cautiously. A man was plowing with a rough wooden plow and a yoke of oxen. He stopped and stared curiously, but said nothing. A lean dog ran out and barked at them, but Waffy threw a stone at it, and the dog ran away, growling. Then they reached a well, where a few little girls were filling their buckets and chattering like magpies. They all stopped talking suddenly and gazed in astonishment at the blue-eyed, fair-haired, and dirty-faced boy who suddenly appeared in their midst, dragging his blistered feet wearily. Some of them in that remote village had never seen such a person before. "Who is he?" they whispered after a moment's silence. "Where does he come from?" "French," said another, and laughed rather rudely. "What has he come for?" said a third in a nervous voice. "Perhaps there are other Frenchmen with him. And that boy there, who is he? He's not from our village." They looked fierce and frightened, and David's heart sank. He felt frightened too, but not fierce, only unutterably weary and hungry and thirsty. "Oh God," he prayed in his heart, "please send someone kind. Please, please take me where I can lie down and go to sleep, and send someone to take us home." The children stood looking at each other shyly and uncertainly. Waffy asked for a drink of water, and the little maidens began giggling and whispering among themselves. They spoke the slow dialect of the tribes, and Waffy's town accent struck them as strange and amusing. The boys moved on, and one of the girls threw a handful of small pebbles after them. But even Waffy was too tired to throw anything back. "Let's go to the river," said David. "We might find some women washing. Little girls are no good." They wandered on past a few thatched mud huts where babies played in the doorways. From one came the sound of a grindstone, but no one noticed the two little boys. They could hear the splashing of the river on the stones now, and around the next turn in the path they saw a little beach ahead of them, where women and girls squatted with their washing. Charcoal fires burned on the stone, with big boiling kettles steaming on top of them, and the amber water was frothy with soap. Clothes and garments of all shapes and sizes, laid out to dry in the sun, decorated the bank. Still no one noticed the two shy children who stood watching, peeping out from behind an olive tree. Suddenly, David jerked to attention. A little figure was coming down the path, singing softly to herself. She could not see him, for she was carrying a big bundle of washing on her shoulder, shutting out all her view on that side, and he could not see her face. But he could see that her back was hunched, and could hear the words she was singing, the words they sang night after night in the hospital wards, when the nurses played the small organ and sang with the patients. "I was lost, but Jesus found me, found his sheep in the desert, carried me back on his shoulders, set my feet in God's way." "Leela!" David yelled, and he flung himself upon her, scattering her dirty washing far and wide all over the path. She gave a little shriek of fear and nearly fell backwards, for although she was older than he was, she was not much larger. "It's me, David, the doctor's son," cried David, his face alight with joy, his weariness forgotten. Leela, recognizing him, thought she must be dreaming, and holding him at arm's length, she stared and stared. But all the time she stared, her face was growing brighter as it slowly dawned on her understanding that this really was her little friend. "Ah, David," she said at last, and then she could say no more, for tears of joy and love were rolling down her cheeks. The women had left their washing on the stones and were all crowding around and shouting questions. They were big women with strong brown arms, but David was not afraid of them. He looked up and laughed at them, and they laughed back at his fair hair and blue eyes. Then they saw Waffy and turned on him with a torrent of questions. "Who? Where? Why?" Waffy squatted down under the olive tree because he was too tired to stand any longer, and told them most of the story, and it lost nothing in the telling. He was particularly careful to inform them that he and David had had nothing to eat since the day before, and they wanted some breakfast. But he remembered their promise and did not mention the guns. The women squatted on the muddy path or stood with their hands on their hips as they listened and uttered exclamations of astonishment. Their voices were loud and their faces were swarthy, but their hearts were very kind, and they all wanted to take the young boys home and feed them. But that honor belonged to Leela. Honors did not often come her way, but David was hers, and hers alone. "Come," she said importantly, gathering the clothes up from the mud and tying them in a bundle. "We will go to my mistress." She turned back up the path, and Waffy and David followed her, refreshed by the very thought of food and rest. They soon came to a cactus hedge enclosing a mud house. 2 children played by the step, and a woman sat in the doorway kneading bread. David recognized her at once. It was the woman he had met on the cliff the day Leela came into the hospital. "My mistress!" cried Leela. "The doctor's son has come. He and another child have come on foot from the coast. We must feed them, my mistress, and take them home." The woman rose at once, quite excited at the news, and drew the children into the cool shade of the hut. She thought it was always good to keep in with the hospital, for who knew who might be ill next? But she was also a kind woman and was touched by the sight of 2 such weary, dirty little boys. She spread a rush mat and brought them buttermilk and coarse rye bread. Leela ran behind the house and came back with 2 brown eggs, which she broke into a frying pan. Then she blew on the charcoal under it. At the smell of the sizzling oil, the children wriggled and squirmed in joyful anticipation. There were no knives and forks. They ate out of one clay dish, cleaning up the last drop of fat with the bread. "When can I go home?" asked David, but he was almost too tired to hear the answer. Nor did he bother much. He was safe with Leela, and she would arrange things somehow. The woman drew the rush mat into a quiet, dark corner, placed a cushion under the boys' heads, and covered them with a bright, hand-woven rug. And without a good night or thank you, they both dropped into a deep, exhausted sleep.